room as you tee it up.
Okay. All right. I did record to the cloud. Is that what we usually do?
Kelly, do you know?
Yeah, you'll be able to get it by going into Zoom and getting it.
Okay.
And it will most likely send you an email too with the recording.
Okay. All right. So yeah, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining, and thank you to Olivia for being willing to do this training for us today. The legislative session is already kicked off. We've already been assigned a few bills, so this is good timing. And I guess before we start, just to kind of put some context here and why we thought it was important to kind of do this level setting with just kind of the basic 101 is that, and I'll go into more of this in our training in a few weeks after the holidays, but really our hope this session is to get you all as the subject matter experts more engaged and involved in the process, really taking advantage of that information that you do have about your subject matter and integrating that more into drafting the legislative action summary and the testimony. And really just, like I said, yeah, to get you more involved, really give you ownership of that process. And, our hope is that it'll be more efficient in the end, save some time, really keep everybody engaged in what's going on as it relates to your work, as it relates to your policy, so that if an LD is to pass and we do have to start implementing, making those changes, you're ready to go, you know what to expect. And again, just, valuing that subject matter that you bring to the table and giving you that ownership in the process. So we'll review more of that in a couple weeks. I'm always here to assist. My favorite thing to do in the world is to get people more engaged and involved in the legislative process. And so I'm really, looking forward to working with you all more this session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Olivia.
Good morning, everyone. I am the other Olivia that you probably have accidentally emailed before. It happens to Olivia Alford and I all of the time. But I am based in the commissioner's office and I work on the legislative team out of that office. My title is Senior Government Relations Advisor, and I work in tandem with Abby Stivers, the Director of Government Relations, and Molly Bogart, who you all are probably familiar with as well, as she was the former Director of Government Relations. So the three of us and Kelly Roman, our administrative assistant, are kind of make up the core 4 team in the commissioner's office. And Kelly and I are likely, if you have questions, I think Megan is probably your first contact if you have questions that relate to the legislature. But I'm also a resource if you ever need to reach out. And so is Kelly. She manages our SharePoint site and kind of all of that behind the scenes magic that we rely on to keep our systems moving. So I talked with Megan before we gathered all of you, and some of this I see Julie and Peter and Olivia, some of this will be a repeat for you or a refresher for you, but I think some of this will be new information too. I'm going to go over just a brief Legislature 101 sort of schoolhouse rock version of our own legislature, just to give you guys kind of a process primer, and then we can get into some of our more internal processes and systems. So stop me if you have any questions. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I don't want to spend too much time in the weeds here. But if anything sparks your interest and you want to discuss more, we can either do that here or happy to have a follow-up meeting. All right, so I'll go through quickly the legislature's membership. What is the legislative session, which I know you guys all know that phrase, but what does that actually mean? Elements of introducing a bill, how to read a bill. It says deep dive into the committee process. We'll do a light dive into the committee process. What happens when a bill makes it back to the House and the Senate? The special tables, you guys have probably heard of the appropriations table, the study table, that sort of stuff. How a bill becomes law, publication of law, and some resources. So again, schoolhouse rock version of this. There are 2 chambers in our state legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives has 151 members. The Senate has 35 members. And you will probably hear the words presiding officers mentioned in the legislative session, either from me or Megan or the other Olivia. We rely on them a lot for guidance and direction throughout the legislative session. This is the Senate president, who is Senator Matty Daughtry, and the Speaker of the House, which is Representative Ryan Fecteau. And the two of them make up the POs, the presiding officers, and they provide a lot of direction to the legislature as a full, and that trickles down to our work as well. So legislative terms are 2 years. We are entering the second session of the 2-year biennium. You'll also hear us call this the short session. So as I said, this equates to 2 years. The first regular session, which we've already completed, was last year. The second regular session we are going into now, that starts in January and it runs through mid-April. Statutory adjournment date, the day that the legislature is statutorily required to adjourn by midnight on, is the third Wednesday of April. That's written into our Mason's manual, and that happens to be tax day this year. As you all have probably heard before, that does not always mean that the legislature actually adjourns on that date. They always have procedural ways of getting around that deadline, and more likely than not, we will wrap up session early May. This will be my 8th legislative session that I've been a part of, and I'd say pretty consistently I think we've only wrapped up on statutory adjournment date 1 or 2 times in those 8 sessions. All right, so as you also know, the elements of introducing a bill, ideas come from all over the place. We have department bills, which you all have worked on likely. Your subject matter expertise is really important to us crafting those bills. And that's one place that a bill idea can come from, is from the department itself and the people that make up those state departments. But they can also come from the governor. There's governor's bills. They can come from legislative committees. We sometimes have bills that are in the legislative committees that, commissions and work groups or task forces that have legislative authority to report out a bill. That's another way a bill can be created. And then, of course, just main citizens, constituents. A lot of times I worked for the legislature directly before I worked for DHHS. And when I was supporting representatives and legislators directly, a lot of their bill ideas came directly from constituents. So I'd say a good chunk that you see in that full list of bill ideas or bill titles that come out around this time of year come from constituents. So we do our best to draft language. We have you all review legislative language or bill language, but the final language that comes to us and is sort of refined to be legally correct comes out of the revisor's office, which is based in the State House. They have a wild team of lawyers in that teeny tiny office in the basement of the State House that spend all of their time writing all of our state statutes. They're wonderfully smart people, and we rely on them to make sure that our language is correct. Let's see. I don't think any of the rest of that is relevant here. Okay, so when a bill or a request for a bill is filed, it's assigned an LR number, and that is what you guys receive or will start receiving. Megan will help facilitate that part. That is the draft language. It's the legislative request number, and it's just a draft. And we have you all look over that language and let us know if it's a department bill. Let us know if that is correct. If it's not a department bill and it's just a regular legislator bill, that language comes to us all in LD form, and that is the next phase. So once language is finalized, an LR gets an LD number, and that language is printed publicly. And when it's a legislator bill, that comes to us, and that's when we weigh in, and that kind of prompts our LAS and engagement process there, which I'm going to pause on that for now. We'll get back into LASs, but that the LD is what you're reviewing when you're putting together the LAS. You've also probably heard of concept drafts. A couple years ago, we had an issue where concept drafts were just kind of taking over the legislature, and all they are is it's just an idea. It usually has one sentence that says this bill is a contract draft that has to do with X, Y, and Z, and no other information or specifics were added to that bill. And legislators use this as a placeholder. They can change that language later down the line. And they've really had to kind of crack down on those because it was sort of ending up in this bottleneck situation where legislators were waiting until the very end of session to come up with that language, and then we were all scrambling on our side of things to weigh in on bills that we didn't have a lot of time to process the actual contents of. So there are less concept drafts this session, which is great, but still something to keep an eye out for. I am going to skip this section, I think, for this group, unless Megan, you feel like this is important, but I'll move to this slide. This is kind of how to read a bill. This is what a bill looks like, and I'll provide this slideshow as a follow-up so you guys can look at all of this more closely if you'd like to. Can also provide this specific how to read a bill explainer if that's helpful. But this just kind of breaks it down what to look for when you're reading language. And my guess is that this is familiar to all of you, but it's helpful to mention. Okay, so then the committee process is, so there are 17 joint standing committees that are focused on different policy areas. So once a bill is printed and the language is public and that language is finalized by the legislator, it's assigned to a committee, and the legislature does that. We don't have a say in which policy committee it goes to. We can certainly, there are behind the scenes channels for that, but generally we do not have influence over that. So you can see the 17 different legislative committees on the right here. Health and Human Services is the committee that we are primarily in. Most bills that we weigh in on fall in that committee, but that's not always true. This past session, we were in the Judiciary Committee a lot more than usual. A couple sessions ago, when Molly was Director of Government Relations, she spent quite a bit of time in state and local government with our CDC team on some public health related bills. We also are in the Health Coverage, Insurance, and Financial Services Committee. We refer to this committee as HCIFS. Most often OHIM is in that committee, but OMS sometimes has some overlap there. And then Education and Criminal Justice we're also in sometimes. So again, this is sort of like in the weeds of the legislative makeup, but the House Speaker and the Senate President appoint all committee members and committee chairs. We don't have a say on who sits on committees in our position here. And so then once the committees are meeting and the bills start to be assigned to the committees, they hold public hearings. And every bill that is printed and has a sponsor has to have a public hearing. And there's rules around how much notice is needed here. But usually we're supposed to have a 14-day notice before a public hearing is scheduled. As the session goes on, that timeline gets shorter and shorter. And so that is when our communication out of the commissioner's office sort of picks up pace to the offices within the department. Towards the end of session and they're running out of time to consider all the bills, it'll often be, a public hearing only needs 48 hours notice and then 24 hours notice. And so that's just I don't want to say a warning because that sounds dramatic, but a heads up that as session goes on, those timelines kind of condense, and we need responses from the subject matter experts and offices a little bit faster. Once a public hearing is done, it's completely up to the committee when a work session is scheduled, but all bills also have to have a work session. And this can happen that same day. This can happen a day or two later, or it can happen a couple weeks later, sometimes even a couple of months later, depending on those behind the scenes conversations that happen with the legislator and sometimes us, sometimes other lobbying groups or stakeholders. And the work session is where they quote work the bill. They get a review of what's in the bill. They get a review from the committee analyst, what was presented in favor and opposition, and then the committee takes a vote on that bill. You'll hear us, if you attend legislative office hours, you'll often hear us use the term vote out. They vote out the bill of committee. So there are different types of reports, and we call it a committee report when they vote on a bill. There's ought to pass, ought not to pass. Ought to pass is amended. Ought to pass a new draft. We rarely see this. Refer to another committee. We can sometimes see this. And then leave to withdraw, which is our favorite thing to see, because that means a legislator decided that they didn't need to pursue it and the bill just dies right then and there, and there's no more work for anybody to do on it. So when you see a LTW, that's a thing to feel happy about, usually at least. And so those are the options that the legislators have in committee to report a bill out to the full legislature. And our unanimous report means that all the committees agreed on a recommended action and the bill received a unanimous vote in committee. This is, again, getting a little bit into the weeds, so bear with me quickly, but the vote that happens in the committee impacts the next steps in the House and Senate. So when a bill is voted out of committee, it goes to the House floor or the Senate floor, depending on where the bill originated. If a senator sponsored it, it goes to the Senate. If a House member sponsored it, it goes back to the House. And if it was if it was a unanimous report, it goes what is called under the hammer. And that is a really generally easy vote in the House. They just read it along with a bunch of other titles that were unanimously reported out, and that bill moves on to the next stage in the legislative process. If it has a divided report, which means that some members of the committee voted ought to pass, some members voted ought not to pass, or there was a misalignment in their votes, that is when the bill faces debate on the Senate or House floor. And that draws out the process, that opens the door for more changes. There are things such as floor amendments that can be introduced in a bill that can change. That is Abby and I's job to monitor that closely when a bill is in this sort of limbo between the House and Senate. And so if there is an amendment that's presented and we need you all to weigh in on it, that communication comes from us. That's not on Megan or anybody in your team to monitor. As you all know, two fiscal notes are a big part of our policy analysis process. We need to understand what the fiscal impact is going to be to the department. And so every bill that affects state revenues has to have a fiscal note. In the legislature, the entity that puts these together is the Office of Fiscal and Program Review, OFPR. You can tell that this slideshow is slightly outdated because I said Ben's team, which is now Todd's team. But they provide a fiscal analysis and estimate to OFPR to assist them in the development of an official fiscal note. But the official fiscal note does come from OFPR. I will just mention this briefly. This isn't super relevant to your work, but there is a House and Senate calendar that is printed every single day of the legislative session. Abby and I review these every single day. It is a full look at what that legislative day is going to entail. And there are that calendar is broken down into different parts that mean, different things. I just mentioned a unanimous report out of committee that goes on what is called the consent calendar. And that is what every item on the consent calendar goes under the hammer. The divided reports are a completely different section of that calendar. And so we look at both of these, and legislators use that as a guide throughout the day. And just a random note for you all, the Senate doesn't have a consent calendar, and there's no real clear reason for that. It's just a fun nuance between the House and Senate. All right, I'm going to skip this part. Reports of committee. More chamber logistics. Again, this is sort of not really for you to worry about, but maybe interested to understand. So that consent calendar and the under the hammer committee reports that I just talked about, the reason that that is a part of our legislative process is that there's a part of the legislative decorum is to trust what the committee has decided. So similar to our reliance on you as subject matter experts to provide us with, accurate information that we can then take to the legislature. That adds credibility for us when we can share that the information, or, when we can instill that trust in the committee members that this came from people who are in the weeds in this work and who know exactly what they're talking about. That gets relayed to the policy experts that sit on the assigned committee. And so when that assigned committee votes out a report, it is, what's the word I'm looking for? Respectful, I guess, of the full legislature to respect the report of the committee. And that is partially because of that engagement with their trusted stakeholders. And so for like the Health and Human Services Committee, that is us. That is the department because we have spent a lot of time building that trust with them. And when we come to them with a position, it doesn't always go that way, but we do bring credibility to that room, and that credibility transfers on into the full legislature. I won't go into engrossment and enactment. If any of you are interested in learning more about this, I'm a legislative nerd. I could talk about this all day long, but I don't want to waste your time learning or teaching about things that aren't necessarily relevant to your work. Sometimes when the House and Senate disagree on a vote of a bill, which can happen and actually happened quite a bit in the first session, I note this because sometimes this does affect our work because if they are not in agreement, they can make changes to the bill, and then we need to come back to you all with. It's not usually a formal weigh-in, but we need to have some discussion so that Abby can then go to the legislators and kind of either encourage them to stick with the way that they voted, or can give them kind of some context of why it may be okay to what is called recede and concur, which is back up and agree with the other chamber. But this all happens towards the end of session. We don't see this generally early on in session. This is kind of the last minute scramble when the chambers are taking these big votes. And the legislature does have a habit of saving the most controversial and toughest topics for the end, which is partially why they rarely adjourn when they are supposed to, is because they're all tired and they can never agree at the end, and they have their biggest issues to still tackle. So then after the bill makes it through all of the parts of the legislature or the legislative process, and the bill has been enacted finally, the governor has 4 options. She can sign the bill, veto the bill, allow the bill to become law without signature, or within 1 day disapprove a dollar amount by using a line item veto. I have seen all of these happen. I'll add a 5th option here, which we saw quite a bit this past session, is she can hold bills, we have a whole list of bills that have been held. And that just means that she has decided to wait until the legislature comes in next session to make a decision on them. And so this doesn't, the way that this affects your work is that whenever it goes into law, we need to pay attention to the general effective date so that implementation can start. The publication of laws. Once a bill becomes a law, it's assigned a chapter number, starts with chapter 1, and it goes on from there. So when the second session concludes, there will be the revisor's office will publish a web page that will have all of the legislation that became chaptered law over the past biennium, and it will run all the way through. And then again, this is I'll provide this slideshow, or Megan will provide you this slideshow, but here are some resources. So there's a glossary of terms. I used that a lot when I first started working for the legislature. There's a lot of terms that don't make innate sense. And so understanding them or through a glossary is very helpful. The roll calls, I think I skimmed over that section, but that is, when a bill is a divided report and there's floor debate and a vote is held, a roll call is held on the Senate or House floor, that means that the legislators' vote is recorded publicly. And so there's a vote count of how they voted yay or nay on a certain bill. And those hyperlinks take you to the House roll calls and the Senate roll calls. What I just mentioned, that link is copies of each enacted measure. That will take you to the list of chaptered law. They also publish a summary of all the bills passed in the legislative session, which is there, and then Senate and House calendars too. So if you ever have any interest in going through a Senate or House calendar, I'm happy to walk you through that. But again, I don't think that that's uber relevant to your work. So that was a super high level overview. I hope I didn't move through that too fast, and I'll pause to see if there's any questions before I say more.
Olivia, I just
question.
go Louise. Go
Go
Louise.
ahead. Oh, my question was about the bills that you mentioned. There are new bills right now. Were those carryover bills, or are they brand new for this short session?
Yeah, great question. So, and I did skim over that part actually. A huge difference between the first and second session in the legislature is that the first session, there is no limit on the number of bills that can be submitted. Legislators, departments, they can submit any number of bills on any topic with any title. There are parameters around titles, but really that any number of bills can be submitted. We move through that process. Louise, to your point, there are also a pocket of carryover bills. And those are bills that a legislative committee decided that they were going to kick the can down the road and carry over into the second session. So there's about 200 in total of those that all of the policy committees decided to carry over. If I remember right, I think Abby told me that there's about 17 of the 200 that have to do with the department. So we will need to weigh in on those. Those are still in play from last legislative session. In the second session, we call it shorthand the emergency session. And the idea is that because it's a short session, the first session runs from January to June, the second session runs from January to April, that all bills that are introduced are supposed to be of emergency nature. This is a very broad term in the Mason's manual, legislative manual, that dictates how our legislature is run. This is just there's not much definition around emergency. And so they leave that up to the legislative council, which is made up of those presiding officers that I mentioned, the Senate president and the Speaker of the House, and their legislative leadership. There are other members. There's a House Majority Leader, there's a Senate Majority Leader, there's a Senate Minority Leader, a House Minority Leader. All of those legislative leadership, they sit around a horseshoe and they decide and vote on each bill that is submitted by a legislator in the second session. And so there are far less bills in the second session, but they are new bills, to answer your question. They are new bills. So the second session kind of cleans up the first session, takes into consideration this new set of bills that are all supposed to be more urgent or of urgent or emergency nature. And so that is collectively, it's still about a third to a half of what is considered in the first session. Yeah.
So, Olivia, I was just trying to see if I kind of have this at a conceptual level. So, like at the federal level, right, you kind of oftentimes have legislation somewhat independent between the houses, and then they work on reconciling at the end. It sounds like in Maine, we try to do a lot of the reconciling and discussing at the beginning and then move the items through. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
I'm following this. So the one question I had is on when you come to the end of the legislative process and there's disagreement between the House and the Senate, as they're reconciling that, are there limitations on what they can do? Can they add in new amendments or is it basically like, okay, we're going to agree with this amendment from the Senate and this amendment from the House, or how's that work?
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of a choose your own adventure, if I'm honest. And the problem is that legislators like to choose their own adventure, and they often choose different adventures. So it can be hard to reconcile that. Um, there are different ways to do that. To your earlier point, there is an emphasis in our legislature in particular that respecting the committee's process and the committee work is really important. And if you tune into the House and Senate debate, you'll hear that often, that we should respect the will of X committee because they put in the work, they had the subject matter experts come before them, they heard the testimony, they did the deliberation. They put some emphasis on that. That being said, it isn't uncommon for a bill to land on the House or Senate floor and for there to be a lot of debate and therefore to be, I mentioned floor amendments. So that is an option. A floor amendment can be offered. There's an option for them to send the bill back to committee. If there's just not enough consensus on the floor, they can do that. That is rare, but as I'm sure it's not a surprise to you all, but things have been tense in the political space the last couple of years. And in the last session, we saw that more than usual. We saw people were especially feisty and were trying harder to kind of pull their own moves, if you will, in that way. And so that's an option. And then the House and Senate, this also happened more this past session than I have seen in the past. They can also just be in disagreement between the two chambers. So the House can vote one way, the Senate can vote another way. And there are different avenues for that. I had mentioned a recede and concur. If the Senate votes differently, that bill goes back to the House, and that the House can either recede and concur and agree with the Senate, or they can do what's called insist, and they send the bill back to them in the form that they voted on. And if the chambers cannot agree, that bill dies between the bodies, which again used to be more rare than what it is, but we saw that a couple of times this past session. If the House and Senate cannot agree, the bill dies. It's between the bodies, or in paper is how we say it. The thing with the legislature is that there are people who work for the legislature who know the legislative manual inside and out and know every single avenue. There's sort of a way to really do anything you want if you try hard enough. There's sort of a loophole for everything, but generally speaking, it would die between the bodies if it's called a non-concurrent matter. I know that was a long answer. Thank you, Michael, for bearing with me. All right. There's no more. Peter, did you have a question? No? Okay.
I have a question.
You do?
Yes. So I know in the past there's been some back and forth about how much information should go into the LAS and what type of information. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about what the commissioner's office hopes to see.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Megan. I was going to move into that. So all of that is just background for like kind of what's going on for Abby and I at the commissioner's office legislative team level. That's kind of everything that we're monitoring. We spend a lot of time over at the State House. Abby sits in the Health and Human Services Committee most days of the week. When we're in other committees, I often staff those so that we have coverage. But what we're doing to take a step back from like well before we end up in the committee room weighing in on the bills is this all of the behind the scenes work that you all help us with. And so that is the LAS that Megan just mentioned. This is the Legislative Action Sheet. I believe I should know what that acronym is, Legislative Action Sheet, LAS. And we use this to inform the governor's office of our process. So this is essentially a template for analysis for all of you. And Abby and I take this every single week. We take every single bill that's been assigned to the department. Okay, let me back up even more. When the bills are printed, Kelly gets a list from the governor's office that has all bills that are assigned from the governor's office to the Department of Health and Human Services. Kelly then reads every single one of those bills and makes her best determination for how or which office that bill affects or touches the most. She then, through our SharePoint system, assigns that bill out to OMS, OBH, CDC, however she reads that bill. Kelly is not a lawyer. Kelly is a extremely smart, overqualified administrative assistant who does her absolute best to do this accurately. But we do rely on you all to read that bill too and say, hey, this also touches CDC. We need them to weigh in, or hey, this has nothing to do with OMS. And sometimes that just happens, but we need you to communicate with the legislative team if that is the case. Or even, I mean, sometimes there's even one sentence in a bill that like might need OBH to weigh in on or something like that. And it's really important that I just want to emphasize that because it's important that Abby and I can trust that behind the scenes work has been done so that when we are trying to meet our deadlines with the governor's office, that work can just be pushed out with the assumption that that due diligence has been done. So the bill is assigned to OMS. When the bill is assigned to OMS, an assignment for the LAS comes from Kelly as well. And I'm going to share that template with you. Okay, can all see that? So this is what the LAS looks like. Do I have I'm going to share a different one. Sorry, one second. Okay. So this is what the LAS looks like. It's the same document that I just shared, but with Kelly's instructions in it. She's wonderful in that way as well. And so this is the document that you will fill out with, and again, Megan is your point person in OMS, and I am Megan's point person in the commissioner's office. And so that's sort of the chain of communication there. But Kelly has this format, so it has instructions with everything that you need to fill out. And it does look like a lot of information, but we've broken it down so that it should be hopefully relatively simple to fill out. So we need the office, the LD, the bill title, the sponsor. And again, this information is all in the bill. And so if you need any assistance reading the bill or finding this information, please let us know. But that information, when you look at a bill, it's all in there and on the first page. So we need a recommended position from you all. So you will read the bill. And I think some people work backwards in this. So I'll go down actually to the bottom first. I think sometimes it's easier to work back. Is you kind of take all of this in the second page into consideration: overview of programmatic implications, expected internal OIT systems impact, overview of technological implications, collaboration with other department office required. This all is meant to prompt you to think through a full bill analysis. And then if you go back up, then you can do your recommended position and your recommended action. And so, there's no action necessary, NAN, support, oppose, neither for nor against. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the concept draft. And if it's a concept draft, it's usually a to be determined because their concept drafts do not have actual language. They just say this is a concept that relates to main care, and it gives no other information than that. So we can't really provide an analysis on that. And then a recommended action based on our position. So, this can be a full combination. No action necessary is no action necessary. But we could be supportive of the bill, but only recommend that we monitor it. So we don't need to necessarily provide testimony. We can just kind of keep an eye on it. And if anything, if amendments come down the pike or anything that we can, it's kind of a promise to the governor's office that we'll monitor it. We can support or oppose it. And if we feel like we need to weigh in on it, then we would recommend letter or testimony. The difference between these two: testimony, we show up in person. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can see you all. Testimony, we show up in person. I don't believe that that would necessarily be any of you unless any of you have a really strong desire to show up in committee and present testimony. Abby and I are happy to have that conversation, but generally it is Olivia or Michelle from OMS that's presenting that testimony. A letter I submit online, so it's formatted almost the same way, other than that it sort of says we're submitting this letter, where testimony is, good morning, Health and Human Services Committee. My name is Olivia Alford. I'm blah, blah, blah for the Office of Humane Care Services. There's a little bit of a different structure there, but generally the content and the point that's being made in a letter and testimony are the same. They're just presented in different ways and submitted in different ways. And so letter is just more informal. That's submitted to the committee members still receive it, they still read it, but they don't have our physical presence in the room. And so last session, the vast majority of our public weigh-in was with letters. That's been something that Abby and I are open to changing. I think our approach has generally been that we want to protect people's time. It's a big ask to come to the legislature. The committee does not always run on time. They start very late sometimes. They can take things out of order. Some days there are days where they can have 12, 14 bills on their docket, and the order that is presented online, they get completely taken out of. I mean, Olivia could speak to this, but we had Olivia come in at 9 a.m. and she is there till 4 p.m. Because that's, even though the bill was technically scheduled second, because that bill was pushed down the line. So it's a big ask to have people come to the legislature. So we do, letters are generally supportive of letters, but if the topic has significant nuance or there's just a little bit more background or context to provide, we tend to encourage testimony. There's also just some nuance there in topics, like for example, this past session, the legislators took just a real particular interest in public health nursing, and so anytime that any bill touched that, we had Dr. Vaugh come so that she could speak to that. But if it's more of a niche topic that we can just deliver pretty clearly through written language, then we're good with that path. So that's what that recommendation that we need from you is, letter versus testimony. Let's see. I'll share my screen again. We do need a summary. Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong one. We do need a summary of the bill, and that is the balance to strike here is, okay, I'm gonna stop trying to talk and share my screen because I clearly can't, my brain can't do that. The summary is a bit of a balance that we need you guys to provide likely more information than less, because Abby and I can take out information that may not feel relevant to the governor's office, but we don't know what we don't have. So if you guys can be a little bit more, you don't need to write 2-3 pages of information, use your best gut, your best judgment on what is relevant to the bill, and really look at what the bill is asking or what the bill is directing OMS to do. We don't need to go into necessarily the what ifs, if this happens, or the domino effect. Really just try to keep the vision as narrow to what the bill would be directing us to do as possible. And then if there are questions that come from that, we can certainly come back to you. But if we give the legislators something to scramble over or to question more, they're going to do that. If we can keep their focus narrow to the topic, that's just generally better for everybody. So that summary is really important. And procedurally, we take that summary that you write and we send it to the governor's office every single week. And we haven't yet figured out our sort of timeline cadence for this session. If I'm remembering correctly, last session, I believe we had a Wednesday or Thursday noon deadline for offices to get their LASs to us, which would give Abby and I 24 hours to get those summaries together to have, I believe our deadline was noon on Friday to the governor's office. And so and that number changes every week. In the heart of session last year, there could be 60, 70 bill summaries that we are sending to the governor's office. It will be less this session just because it is the short session and there are less bills to consider, but still it's a pretty heavy lift to pull together across the department all of those summaries. So we really need that the LASs to be to us by the deadline. I don't have that deadline for you yet just because the governor's office hasn't provided it to us. But as soon as we hear when our LASs or when our summaries are due, we will set our LAS deadline for you all, and you'll know that. But all of that analysis that you provide us through the LAS, that is pulled and that is sent to the governor's office, and our policy advisor in the governor's office, Beth Bosang, you've probably heard her name before. She sits down with the governor every single week and goes through those summaries. So the governor does read what we put together, and she does take into account our input, and then we get guidance or feedback from them on what position we can take on a bill. And Megan, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, so stop me if I am, but the SharePoint system that Kelly has built and we're all operating in, she has built in these systems that allow for these documents to kind of move through the process. So when she assigns an LAS, she does that through SharePoint. I think, Megan, you get that? Okay, so Megan gets that notification. Then there's the whole internal OMS piece that I defer to Megan on of how she distributes that out to all of you. But then once that LAS is complete, it comes back to the commissioner's office and is marked in our SharePoint system as like CO review. I review it, Abby reviews it, finalizes it. It goes to the governor's office. We get guidance back from the governor's office. We either have to come back to you and say, we need more information, or the governor is concerned about this. Do you share that concern, or would you push back on it? Whatever it may be. But whenever we get that green light from the governor's office, that is also documented in SharePoint as GO approved. So you should be able to go into the SharePoint site and see any bill number and see where that bill is in that process. Again, I'm not sure how helpful that is to say to this group, but for Megan's purposes, it is probably helpful.
And I will I'm going to send everybody's names to Kelly before the next training to make sure that you all have access to it, because we will be working within that more this session.
Okay. Would it be helpful for me to briefly share that site, or do you want to do that down the road, Megan?
Sure, if you want to give them a peek, and then
okay. I will do that. Let's see. Okay, so this is our LD tracker that Kelly put together. This has every bill. You can see 481 is what we considered last session. We will consider less this session, but it'll still be a good number. So the best thing about this for me is that you can filter any which way in this spreadsheet. So this is probably the most useful for you all. When you have access to the spreadsheet, if you filter by OMS, you're just going to see bills that have been assigned to OMS. You can completely filter out anything else. If you want to do co-lead, you want to see anything that OMS is co-lead on, you can filter for that. You can filter by due date, the LAS. You can filter by position, the action. You'll see this is kind of what I was talking about: submitted to committee, not assigned. I'm trying to see if there's any other options here right now. You can see CO approved, Gov approved. They end up in Olivia review. That's for me to keep track of, but I filter the spreadsheet every single morning when the legislature is in session for Olivia review, and I go in and see what's in my queue. And so this last session was the first time that we were using this spreadsheet, and it was just a complete game changer. And you can use the search bar. So if you know an LD off the top of your head, you can just put that in instead of scrolling through all of this. And then I'll just show you really quickly let's see if I can pull up here's an OMS one. LD 35. If you click on this, the dashboard kind of shows up. You can see the LD, the bill type, which is a legislator. If it was a department bill, it would say department. The title. Kelly always links to the bill details. That takes you to the bill webpage, and this kind of gives you a full overview of that bill and its process through the legislative life cycle. There's also an LD folder that we keep everything in. So this is where the LAS lives. This is where you guys wrote a letter for this last session. So that lives in here. We have a public hearing and work session summary document that the offices fill out. That's in here. And then again, you can see here kind of an overview of or a highlight reel, I guess, of the bill. So the LAS was CO approved, our position was opposed, the testimony was submitted to committee. And so this just gives a really great snapshot of kind of where the bill is at. You can see what the vote was. This would be a divided report because it was ought to pass as amended and ought not to pass. So this bill went to the House and Senate floors and had some floor debate. The other thing I'll just note, and Megan, I've emphasized this with you, we learned kind of halfway through last session, that this comment section here is hugely helpful to Abby and I, because we essentially live in this spreadsheet or this system in session. And we, if we're in committee and they say, okay, next up is LD 1991, we put in 1991 here, we click on the bill. I know I'm not clicking on 1991, but we look at this snapshot and we go to the bill folder. So we have all the materials we need, but this comment section was just so helpful because, if there was any question about anything or any minor update, we started to use that. So had conversation with Olivia and OMS, or whatever the update may be. I encourage offices, if you're any sort of minor update, to just drop it in there so that Abby and I have the most, up-to-date information possible. And again, that might be more on Megan's end, but it's probably still helpful for you guys to visualize what that spreadsheet is and what how we utilize it. Okay, I've thrown a lot of information at you all with 5 minutes left. So is anybody feeling anxious or concerned, or can I answer any questions? Megan, is there anything else I left off?
I was just wondering if someone could put the link to where you can listen to when bills and LDs are being proposed.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there was a question in the chat earlier about the live stream. Allison asked that, and Megan, thank you for responding. But yes, the legislative committees are statutorily required to be available publicly, and so they put them online. They stream them online every time that they meet. They're not always what is the word? Technologically advanced, I guess. But every committee is live streamed. And so, yep, Sybil got it, or beat me to it. I was just about to put that in. So this link that Sybil just put in the chat, you choose a committee. Again, HHS is what we're most frequently in, but if you're looking at that bill page, you'll see the committee that it's assigned to. It might be criminal justice, it might be judiciary, and you'll use that drop down to choose which committee you want to tune into, and you just hit play, and they're usually there. The tough thing about the system that they use to live stream is you can't toggle well. So if you know a bill is fourth in line, but you don't know if it was taken out of order, you just kind of have to jump around. And even that comment section, we started to use that for, if I was watching a work session back, I would say LD blah, blah, blah starts at 10:42 a.m. on this date, so that whoever needed to go back and look at that work session or public hearing could see or know exactly when to find that. In the pandemic, they used YouTube, and they had a screen that would say what LD they were considering, and it was the best thing ever. But as we came out of the pandemic, they switched back to their legislative site, and that feature is no longer there, unfortunately. So we're back to just blindly guessing.
And again, we'll review, some of the stuff in a couple weeks. And then if you have any questions that you think of in the meantime, you can either send them to me and or you can bring them up at that training. But regardless, I can follow up with Olivia if you think of questions after the fact.
Yep. And you're always welcome to message me with any questions about procedure or whatnot. I'm very happy to answer those. And I'm also happy to hop on a call if there's a question. Again, I'm a little bit of a legislative nerd. If my job could be to give trainings on how the legislature works, I would. My final graduate school project was on the pros and cons of our part-time citizen legislature. So I certainly can talk about this for a while if anybody has more interest. But please use the slideshow. There's some good links in there, just some more information that I skimmed over pretty lightly. And yeah, we're about 2 weeks out. So appreciate all of your work. Again, I know the commissioner's office, we understand that there is a lot of nuance in the internal systems and processes that each office uses. And just how you're structured. And so very much appreciate Megan taking this time, because I know that there's a bit of a shift to, or trying to be a little bit of a shift to relying more on the subject matter experts. And again, that just benefits us all the way down the pike, because we really trust that the information is coming from those that are in the weeds on this work, and what's being presented to us is accurate and factual. And it also just helps expand our contacts. If we know who put together the LIS, then we know who to go to. And it's just a little bit less work for Megan to kind of facilitate all of that. So you might be hearing more from me directly this session, maybe from Abby as well, and probably Kelly too. So just thank you so much for your work. I know that this is not any of your full-time job, and it adds more to your plate when the legislature is in session, but very, very grateful, because we quite literally couldn't do it without you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Olivia.
Yeah, bye.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Olivia.
everyone. Have a good day.